English 2, Unit 1, Common Summative Writing Assessment. The author of this story, Julia Alvarez, was born in New York but spent the first 10 years of her childhood in the Dominican Republic until her family had to flee the country due to her father's involvement in political rebellion. The following story is from the novel How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents, which is about the lives of four sisters spanning 30 years in both the United States and the Dominican Republic. Yolanda's mother spends her time inventing all sorts of things. In this short story, Yolanda struggles to write a speech for school, so her mother helps her, but her father is not happy with the speech at all. After Yolanda's father rips the speech up, Yolanda and her mother sit down to write a more acceptable speech. Consider what theme or message Alvarez conveys through plot and characterization. The prompt: write an essay analyzing how the author uses plot and characterization to convey the theme of a story. Daughter of Invention by Julia Alvarez. In ninth grade, I was chosen by my English teacher, Sister Mary Joseph, to deliver the Teacher's Day address at the school assembly. Back in the Dominican Republic, I was a terrible student. No one could ever get me to sit down to a book. But in New York, I needed to settle somewhere, and the natives were unfriendly, the country inhospitable, so I took root in the language. By high school, the nuns were reading my stories and compositions out loud to my classmates as examples of imagination at work. This time, my imagination jammed. At first, I didn't want, and then I couldn't seem to write that speech. I suppose I should have thought of it as a great honor, as my father called it, but I was mortified. I still had a pronounced lilt to my accent, and I did not like to speak in public, subjecting myself to my classmates' ridicule. Recently, they had begun to warm toward my sisters and me, and it took no great figuring to see that to deliver a eulogy for a convent full of crazy, old, overweight nuns was no way to endear myself to the members of my class. But I didn't know how to get out of it. Week after week, I'd sit down, hoping to polish off some quick, non-committal little speech. I couldn't get anything down. The weekend before our Monday morning assembly, I went into a panic. My mother would just have to call in and say that I was in the hospital, in a coma. I was in the Dominican Republic. Yeah, that was it. Recently, my father had been talking about going back home to live. My mother tried to calm me down. Just remember how Mr. Lincoln couldn't think of anything to say at the Gettysburg. Then, bang! Fourscore and once upon a time ago, she began reciting. Her version of history was half invention and half truths, and whatever else she needed to prove a point. Something is going to come if you just relax. You'll see, the Americans say. Necessity is the daughter of invention. I'll help you. All weekend, she kept coming into my room with help. Please, Mommy, just leave me alone, please. I pleaded with her, but I'd get rid of the goose only to have to contend with the gander. My father kept poking his head in the door just to see if I had fulfilled my obligations, a phrase he'd used when he were a little younger, and he'd check to see whether he had gone to the bathroom before a car trip. Several times that weekend around the supper table, he'd recite his valedictorian speech from when he graduated from high school. He'd give me pointers on delivery, on the great orators and their tricks. Humbleness and praise and falling silent with a great emotion were his favorites. My mother sat across the table, the only one who seemed to be listening to him. My sisters and I were forgetting a lot of our Spanish, but my father's formal, florid diction was even harder to understand. But my mother smiled softly to herself and turned the lazy Susan at the center of the table around and around as if it were the prime mover, the first gear of attention. That Sunday evening, I was reading some poetry to get myself inspired. Whitman, in an old book in an engraved cover my father had picked up in a thrift shop next to his office a few weeks back. I'd celebrate myself and sing myself. He most honors my style who learns under it to destroy the teacher. The poet's words shocked and thrilled me. I had gotten used to the nuns, a literature of appropriate sentiments, poems with a message, expurgated texts. But here was a flesh and blood man, belching and laughing and sweating in poems. Who touches this book touches a man. That night, at last, I started to write recklessly. 3, 5 pages, looking up only once to see my father passing the hall on tiptoe. When I was done, I read over my words, and my eyes filled. I finally sounded like myself, in English. As soon as I had finished that first draft, I called my mother to my room. She listened attentively, as she had my father's speech, and in the end her eyes were glistening too. Her face was soft and warm and proud. That is a beautiful, beautiful speech, Coquita. I want for your father to hear it before he goes to sleep. Then I will type it for you, all right? Down the hall we went, the two of us, faces flushed with accomplishment, into the master bedroom where my father was propped up on his pillows, still awake, reading the Dominican papers, already days old. He had become interested in his country's fate again. The dictatorship had been toppled. The interim government was going to hold the first free election in 30 years. There was still some question in his mind whether or not we might want to go back. History was in the making. Freedom and hope were in the air again. But my mother had gotten used to life here. She did not want to go back to the old country, where she was only a wife and a mother, and a failed one at that, since she had never had the required son. She did not come straight out and disagree with my father's plans. Instead, she fussed with him about reading the papers in bed, soiling those sheets with his poorly printed foreign tabloids. The Times is not that bad, she'd claim if my father tried to humor her by saying that they shared the same dirty habit. The minute my father saw my mother and me filling in, he put his paper down, and his face brightened as if at long last his wife delivered a son. And that was the news we were bringing him. His teeth were already grinning from the glass of water next to the bedside lamp. So he lisped when he said, speech, speech. It is so beautiful, Papi. My mother previewed him, turning the sound off on his TV. She sat down at the foot of the bed. I stood before both of them, blocking their view to the soldiers and helicopters landing amid silenced gun reports and explosions. A few weeks ago, it had been the shores of the Dominican Republic. Now it was the jungles of Southeast Asia they were saving. My mother gave me the nod to begin reading. I didn't need much encouragement. I put my nose to the fire, as my mother would have said, and I read from start to finish without looking up. When I was done, I was a little embarrassed at my pride in my own words. I pretended to quibble with a phrase or two I was sure I'd talked about of changing. I looked questioningly to my mother. Her face was radiant. She turned to share her pride with my father. But the expression on his face shocked us both. His toothless mouth had collapsed into dark zero. His eyes glared at me, then shifted to my mother accusingly. In barely audible Spanish, as if secret microphones or informers were all about, he whispered, "You will permit her to read that?" My mother's eyebrows shot up. Her mouth fell open. In the old country, any whisper of a challenge to authority could bring the secret police in their black VWs. But this was America. People could say what they thought. "What is wrong with her speech?" my mother questioned him. "What is wrong with a speech?" My father wagged his head at her. His anger was always more frightening in his broken English, as if he had mutilated the language in his fury. And now there was nothing to stand between us and his raw, dumb anger. "What is wrong? I will tell you what is wrong. It shows no gratitude. It is boastful. I celebrate myself. The best students learn to destroy the teacher." He mocked my plagiarized words. "This is insubordinate. It is improper. It is disrespecting of her teachers." In his anger, he had forgotten his fear of lurking spies. Each wrong he voiced was a decibel higher than the last outrage. Finally, he was yelling at me. As your father, I forbid you to say that to speech. My mother leapt to her feet, a sign always that she was about to make a speech or deliver an ultimatum. She was a small woman, and she spoke all of her pronouncements standing up, either for more protection or as a carryover from her girlhood in convent schools, where one asked for and literally took the floor in order to speak. She stood by my side, shoulder to shoulder. We looked down at my father. That is no tone of voice, Eduardo, she began. By now, my father was truly furious. I suppose it was bad enough I was rebelling, but here was my mother joining forces with me. Soon, I would be surrounded by a house full of independent American women. He, too, leapt from his bed, throwing off his covers. The Spanish newspapers flew across the room. He snatched my speech out of my hand, held it before my panicked eyes, a vengeful, mad look in his own, and then once, twice, three, four, countless times, he tore my prize into shreds. Are you crazy? My mother lunged at him. Have you gone mad? That is her speech for tomorrow you have torn up. Have you gone mad? He shook her away. You were going to let her read that? That insult to her teachers? Insult to her teachers? My mother's face had crumbled like a piece of paper. On it was a written love note to my father. Ever since they had come to this country, their life together was a constant war. This is America, Poppy, America, she reminded him now. You are not in a savage country anymore. I was on my knees, weeping wildly, collecting all the little pieces of my speech, hoping that I could put it back together before the assembly tomorrow morning. But now, even a Sybil could have made sense of all those scattered pieces of paper. All hope was lost. He broke it. He broke it, I moaned as I picked up a handful of pieces. Probably, if I had thought a moment about it, I would not have done what I did next. I would have realized my father had lost brothers and comrades to the dictator Trujillo. For the rest of his life, he would be haunted by blood in the streets and late-night disappearances. Even after he had been in the States for years, he jumped if a black Volkswagen passed him on the street. He feared anyone in uniform. The meter maid giving out parking tickets, a museum guard approaching to tell him not to touch his favorite Goya at the Metropolitan. I took a handful of the scraps I had gathered, stood up, and hurled them in his face. Tapita, I said in a low, ugly whisper. You're just another tapita. It took my father only a moment to register the hated nickname of our dictator, and he was after me. Down the halls we raced, but I was quicker than he and made it to my room just in time to lock the doors as my father threw his weight against it. He called down curses on my head, ordered me on his authority as my father to open the door this very instant. He throttled the doorknob, but to no avail. My mother's love of gadgets saved my hide that night. She had hired a locksmith to install good locks on all bedroom doors, after our house had been broken into while we were in the previous summer. In case burglars broke in again and we were in the house, they'd have a second round of locks to contend with before they got to us. Eduardo, she tried to calm him down. Don't you ruin my new locks. He finally did calm down, his anger spent. I heard their footsteps retreating down the hall. I heard their door close, the clicking of their lock. Then muffled voices, my mother's peaking in anger, in persuasion, my father's deep murmurs of explanation and self-defense. At last, the house fell silent before I heard, far off, the gun blast and explosions. The serious, self-important voices of newscasters reporting their TV war. A little while later, there was a quiet knock at my door, followed by a tentative attempt at the doorknob. Cuquita, my mother whispered. Open up, Cuquita. Go away, I wailed, but we both knew I was glad that she was there, and I needed only a moment's protest to save face before opening that door. What we ended up doing that night was putting together a speech at the last moment. 2 brief pages of stale compliments and polite commonplaces on teachers, wrought by necessities without much invention, my mother for daughter, late into the night, into the basement of the pad of our paper, which was the same pencil she had once used for her own inventions. for I was too upset to compose that speech myself. After it was drafted, she typed it up while I stood by, correcting her misnomers and missayings. She was very proud when I came home the next day with the success story of the assembly. The nuns had been flattered, the audience had stood up and given our devoted teachers the standing ovation, what my mother had suggested they do at the end of the speech. She clapped her hands together as I recreated the moment for her. I stole that from your father's speech, remember? Remember how he put it in the end? She quoted him in Spanish, then translated for me into English. That night, I watched him from the upstairs hall window, where I'd retreated the minute I heard his car pull up in the front of our house. Slowly, my father came up the driveway, a grim expression on his face as he grappled with a large, heavy cardboard box. At the front door, he set the package down carefully and patted all of his pockets for his house keys, precisely why my mother had invented her ticking keychain. I heard the snapping opening of the locks, heard as he struggled to maneuver the box through the narrow doorway. Then he called my name several times, but I would not answer him. My daughter, your father, he loved you very much, he explained from the bottom of the stairs. He just want to protect you. Finally, my mother came up and pleaded with me to go down and reconcile with him. Your father did not mean to harm. You must pardon him. Always, it is better to let bygones be forgotten, no? I guess she was right. Downstairs, I found him setting up a brand new electric typewriter on the kitchen table. It was even better than the one I'd been begging to get, like my mother's. My father had outdone himself with all the extra features: a plastic carrying case with my initials and decals below the handle, a brace to lift the paper upright while I typed, an erase cartridge, an automatic margin tab, a plastic hood like toaster cover to keep the dust away. Not even my mother, I think, could have invented such a machine. But her inventing days were over just as mine were starting up with school-wide success. That's why I've always thought of that speech my mother wrote for me as the last invention rather than the suitcase rollers everyone else in the family remembers. It was as if she had passed on to me her pencil and pad and said, "Okay, Kukita, the buck, you give it a shot."